Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Reddit series video from the subreddit HFY called Glintstone Chapter 23 Pirates, written by some guy named Ted. The ground shook beneath Sikador's new bulk. His armored feet sank into the dirt, leaving a trail behind him, stretching back to the bird village. They did not have the information that he needed. Silkador felt the coals of rage in his chest. Glintstone had managed to cover his tracks far too well. 2 weeks in the field and Sikador was no closer to finding the human than when he had started. But he would find the human. If he had to burn planets to ash, he would find Glintstone. "Sir!" The Stonebreaker stood to attention in front of Sikador as he walked. "A message from the Emperor." Sikador paused. It had been a month since he had heard from the Emperor, a month since he had been authorized to create the Stonebreakers and hunt down Glintstone and the bandits. The scientists Sikador had found floating adrift in 2 weeks to convert the men Sikador needed into an army of terror. Sikador had himself undergone the procedure, leaving him even more formidable than before. "Very well," Sikador growled, his voice booming and deep, nearly augmented like the rest of him. "What does His Highness High Out Act want from me?" His Stonebreaker's face could not show emotion, but Sikador could see in the way that the breaker held himself that he was deeply surprised by the general's use of the Emperor's name. Let him be. Sikador was a senior enough to use the Emperor's true name. He was a member of the Inner Circle. The breaker was not easily shocked, not for long, but he conveyed the Emperor's message. The Emperor orders the Stonebreakers to cease searching for the rebel Glintstone and to report to Mahing's system. Further instructions will be relayed there. Sikador growled deep in his broad chest. He was on the trail of the apostate Glintstone, the abomination who had dealt hard blows to the Empire's outer regions. Yet the Emperor had decided that the very reason for the Stonebreakers' existence was less important than whatever mission he had thought up. But orders were orders. "Gather the rest of the Stonebreakers," Sikador ordered. "The Emperor has need of our services, and we shall leave now." As the breakers left to carry out his orders, Sikador continued on his path, his thoughts filled with Glintstone and how he would suffer when the breaker general caught up to him. Thoughts growing ever darker, he hardly noticed when a single figure burst from the undergrowth and charged him, screaming. It was a scream of a helpless rage and impotence. The swarm watched with disinterest as the survivor from the village from the Stonebreakers had just burned to the ground attacked, plasma weapon firing incessantly into Sikador's chest. It did nothing. He smiled inwardly, and look of shock on the survivor's ash and tear-streaked face. Striding forward, oblivious to the plasma fire, Sikador brought his arm down and across, catching the attacker on the side. The force of the impact threw the meager attacker into the air and out of the general's line of sight. He did not even look to see when the body landed. It had been a killing blow, and Sikador did not concern himself with the dead. If he could have grinned, he would have. The scientists had done very well. Glintstone would not be able to face the Stonebreakers and live, no matter what weapons he had. But that would have to wait. Sikador had a mission from the Emperor, and he intended to see it carried out with extreme precision. As the walls of the training camp grew larger, Morrowick felt his stomach full with apprehension. It had been a month and a half since he had left this place, vanished in shame. He was almost certainly presumed dead, not that anyone would have missed him. He had been a weak, untrained soldier, one who did not listen to his commanding officer and got his tusk removed, one who had finally failed enough times that his drill sergeant had banished him into the wastes. He had been expected to die. He hadn't. Morrowick was a stubborn sworm as he had lived. He had also stumbled across a group of rebels and was now trying to get them into the training camp so that they could steal the ship and escape. In order to do that, though, Morrowick needed to be on the inside, and the only way to do that was to prove that he was worthy of the title Soldier of the Swarm Empire. That was the only way that he would be allowed back in. Shifting his shoulders to better situate his shirt, Moroi straightened his back and lifted his head, thrusting his tusk into the air. His stump hung there, just on the edge of his vision, proof of his past failures. He did not let that bother him, though. Moroi had long since stopped caring what others thought. It was the only way for him to survive. The walls loomed overhead as he reached the side gate. From what he could see, there was no one on the other side. That boded well for his plan. Raising his fist, Moroi brought it down on the rough metal, weathered by the winds and the dust of the planet. He knocked 3 times hard and stood back from the gate, waiting for a response. It was long in coming. "Who's there?" The voice behind the gate sounded slightly shocked that there would be anyone on the outside. No one went outside, and no one came back through the side gate. For Moroi, hearing a sworn voice felt strange. He hadn't heard one since his banishment over a month and a half ago. "I am recruit Moroi, returned from the wastes." There was a pause. "From the wastes, you said?" "That's right." "But no one comes back from the wastes." This was true. It was the final test for the recruits, and they had to cross it to pass. If they did, they were immediately shipped off to another camp. All the wastes were used as an unofficial execution, and the dead sworn did not return. His confusion was understandable, and Moroi likely would have reacted the same had he been in the same position. But right now, he was hampering Moroik's mission. "I did now open the gate, or I will be forced to break it down." Not that he could, but it was the best to appear as a hardened individual who just survived one of the most hostile landscapes known to the swarm kind, because he was, and he had. "What is your business here?" Moroi wanted to yell at him, but that had just returned from the wastes, and all he wanted to do was get in, get himself reinstated, and sneak a few rebels back into the base, and then escape on a stolen ship. But he didn't. "I returned from my banishment, and I need to speak with Drill Sergeant Kralal. In order to return, he must approve it." "You're not recognized recruit here. I can't allow you in," the guard said, his voice quickly returning to an infuriating dull tone that the swarm who were assigned to guard duty with the desolate planet all seemed to have. Moroi assumed that he was a sheer lack of weight between their ears. "I was banished. I need to talk to Kralal to get reinstated," Moroi half shouted at the guard. There was a long pause on the other side of the door. "Wait for a moment," the guard replied. "I shall find someone to escort you." Moroi inhaled deeply. Finally, he stood there quietly for several minutes. He heard the scuffing of feet on the other side and shrugged his pack to a more comfortable position on his back. The locking mechanism clicked and the door swung open. There stood 2 swarm, one dressed in full uniform, the other dressed in regular dress. The one in uniform was the guard. The swarm in casual dress stepped forward. "I will be your escort. You will not deviate from the path I take you on. You will not speak to anyone, and you will not ask questions. Am I understood?" "Ah, so he was one of the squad captains then." While in training, the recruits were divided into different groups of equal number, chosen at random. These were the squads. Squads trained, ate, slept, and bled together. One swarm was chosen by the drill sergeant to lead it. They were always a hard-ass and no-nonsense types, the ones who made excellent officers and piss-poor comrades. "Yes," Moroi said, nodding without a word. The squad captain turned on his heels and marched out into the sunlight. Moroi followed. As he walked through the brief tunnel under the wall, he quickly oriented himself within the camp. A month and a half had done little to dampen the memories of this place. Now, where to find Kralal and prove his worthiness? The squad captain took him to the course towards the southern half of the base. The sounds of fighting ring carried out in a faint breeze, and Moroi nodded to himself. That would be the place to find him. Kralal seemed to take a disturbing amount of pleasure from beating the pup out of new recruits. Moroi had been one such recruit, taking the full force of Krelal's anger. But that would change now. Krelal had banished Moroi for being weak, slow, fearful. Moroi was smaller than most swarm, and so he was not exactly a soldier material. Neither did he find the kidding others beings enjoyable. He did not wish to join the swarm army. He had been content to stay on the swarm and help manage his grandfather's store. But they had made him come, like they had come for his brother. Moroi was stubborn, far too stubborn for his own good, if his grandfather was to be believed. He was not going to let Krelal or anyone walk over him with not getting payback. Moroi had to prove himself to return to the camp, and so he would have to face Krelal in the ring. Oh, there was other ways he could have proved his worthiness, but he thought the most satisfying way would be to beat Krelal in the ring. The bandits had trained him well in the last month and a half. They were as harsh and as tough as Krelal had been, but they had not been cruel. Jua and Vienna knew exactly what to teach him, and when. Moroi had learned more in a few days than Krelal had taught him in months, and because they had been out in the wastes with very little to do other than train or sleep, Moroi had trained all day, every day, without fail. He had become good. The 3 lesser bandits had been better than him before his training, but now he was their equal. But Jua and Vienna were still far out of his league, and from what he heard from them, their commander, Clint and Tedek were even better. Moroi looked forward to meeting them. "We have arrived," the squad captain said roughly. "Wait here and do not move." Moroi looked up to see the fighting ring spread out before him, a wide circle of dirt, watered hourly, turning it into a vast sea of thick, sticky mud. It was incredibly difficult to fight in, filling the surroundings areas with a number of training equipment and other sparring platforms where recruits could face off against each other in preparation for the fighting ring. Only 2 people ever used the fighting ring, Krelal and whoever he was beating the pulp out of. Moroi had been the unlucky soul before his banishment. Many times Krelal picked him out of the crowd and beat him as a training exercise. Moroi intended to change that today. "Look at who has decided to return. The prodigal son returns from the journey through the desert." Moroi looked around to see Krelal marching through the mass of training recruits. There was a good 3 feet under either side as he walked through. The captain followed close behind, a faithful henchman. Standing his ground, Moroi did not flinch as Krelal strode up to him, close enough that Moroi could smell his breath. He had eaten toadfish recently. He stood inches away, using a greater height to stare down at Moroi, trying to cow him. He had done so many times before, and it had worked very well. But Moroi refused to let it happen this time. He stood solid, meeting Krelal's eyes. Moroi stared back into the eyes of the cruelest one he knew, the meanest and most terrifying being Moroi had met, and he vowed that he was not afraid. Oh, he knew that Krelal could very easily have him killed, but he did not care, and so Moroi stared into the eyes of the squirm who had tormented him and did not yield. They stood there for several seconds, locked in a silent battle. Krelal seeking to force Moroi into surrender, and Moroi refusing to do so. Finally, Moroi saw the faintest flicker of Krelal's eyes, and the drill sergeant seemed to realize that he would not win this one. Instead, he leaned in even closer and whispered in a voice that ensured everyone around him could hear it. "I see that you've survived the wastes, but you will not survive what comes next." Moroi did not react to Krelal's threat, not wanting to give him the satisfaction. Instead, he whispered back, "I think you will be surprised." The drill sergeant backed away, a faint, dark smile on his lips. In the normal tone he said, "The banished has returned from his exile, but he has not yet proved himself worthy of re-entry." This was directed out into the massive swarm that had gathered during Moroik's arrival. He glanced around, but he could not see any familiar faces. They had likely moved on to another training camp. That was good. Moroi had not liked any of them. Krillal returned the gaze to Moroi. Now, Taskless, how do you plan on proving yourself? If I remember correctly, you can't shoot, run, climb, or fight, so your option. I wish to prove myself in the ring. Moroi interrupted, smiling inside as a look of faint shock on the drill sergeant's face. No one interrupted him. He was the top of the food chain here, and he was treated with, if not respect, fear. But he recovered quickly, enough so that it hardly seemed that he had been surprised. You do you? Very well, I shall indulge you, Krillal said in a satisfied tone. Who do you want to challenge to a fight in the ring? As an exile who needed to prove himself, Moroi was allowed to choose an opponent to test himself against. He was not free to choose anyone in the camp, only those whose skills surpassed his at the time of banishment. Those rules were a little murky and not well versed, as no one had ever returned from exile. And Krillal, as the highest ranked in the area, was allowed to approve or disapprove of Moroik's choice. Moroik knew that he would decline all of them in order to spite Moroik. The last choice would be Krillal himself. He would expect Moroik to choose lesser fighters, and then he would decline each of them. When Moroik had run out of choices and he was growing desperate, Krillal would take the pleasure in the fact that he would be the only one whom Moroik could challenge, the one who had banished him in the first place. Moroik would not give him that satisfaction. I challenge you, Drill Sergeant. Krillal had already begun to form the words to deny the challenge, expecting Moroik to pick one of the squad captains or similar, but he had not been expecting to be challenged so quickly. The opportunity was too good to pass up. Denied? You mean to say that you will decline to fight me? Am I so terrifying? Moroik felt a little of the grin he felt show itself on his face, and he quickly returned to his stone-faced exterior. It would do no good if Krillal ordered his henchmen to beat Moroik to a pulp. As it was, the drill sergeant's face grew red with rage. His authority had been questioned, and now his ability had been as well. He nearly spluttered as he spoke. I accept your challenge. Tuskless, I shall take great pleasure in defeating you. With that, they turned and a heel and marched to the center of the ring. The recruits parted with the drill sergeant, none wishing to incur his wrath. Moroik, for his part, smiled faintly and followed him into the ring. They both moved to the edge of the ring and removed their shirts and boots and belts, leaving them naked but for their pants. Stepping forward into the center of the ring, Moroik waited for Krillal. He sized up his opponent. Krillal was a good 5 inches taller than Moroik, with a greater reach and a fair bit more muscle, and he was vicious. Krillal took intense pleasure in harming his opponents and sought to do as much damage as it could. It was not uncommon for recruits to leave the ring with broken limbs. When Krillal turned around, Moroik saw him falter for a brief second. The sight made him smile. He knew why, too. After a month and a half of training with the Rebellion Special Forces, Moroik had been transformed from the small, weak worm that he had been before. His body had filled out, and he had a good amount of fresh muscle all across his body. He also carried himself differently. Moroik knew that he walked with a smoother, more comfortable stride, and held his body with an unconscious, ready stance. After a month and a half of surprise attacks by Jua and Vienna, it was second nature. It was a strange feeling knowing how much he had changed, but he had. Krillal had been expecting some cowardly swarm that would be banished, no one that he could easily torment and devastate in the ring. What Krillal saw was vastly different than what he had expected. But Krillal was a professional soldier, one who had seen years of combat. But he did not let many things affect him for long. He strode out into the center of the ring, eyes locked with Moroik. There was a certain formality to the ring. Both combatants met in the center, silently, respectful, but thinking of how to destroy their opponents. Moroi pondered how he was going to destroy Krillel. His training was a unique blend of swarm discipline and rebellion ruthlessness. The swarm was away ruthless as well, but the rebellion style was to win by any means necessary. Moroi had tried the swarm way in the past, and it had gotten him banished. It was time to try a new way. The squad captain took off the side of the ring. He would be the official judge of this match. Most sessions in the ring did not have a judge, but this was not most sessions. "Combatants ready?" he asked, his voice betraying the excitement that he was likely feeding. It was not every day he got to see his sergeant beat the living daylights out of a recruit. Both Moroi and Krillel nodded, each of them with a smile on their face. They backed away from each other, putting 6 feet between themselves. When the signal was given, that distance would be closed and the fight would begin. When Moroi was in position, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. The noise of the gathered recruits, the heat of the sun, and the silent worries inside his head. The only existed the sensation of his body felt, the sight of Krillel, and the arm of the squad captain held upright. The arm slashed down, and the fight began. Moroi rushed forward to meet Krillel at the center of the ring. His greatest advantage was that Krillel did not know the extent of his new training. Moroi knew almost everything about Krillel's fighting style. He had gone up against him many times. He had seen the drill sergeant fight many more times, vicious, overpowering, and devastating, but none too creative. Therefore, creativity would help. Before Moroi could begin to get creative, he had to show Krillel that he truly meant business. The space between them closed in a moment. Krillel began the match the way he always did, with a vicious blow from one of his fists. Every time Moroi had fought him, he had always tried to avoid the swing, as it was deadly. Every recruit did. One could not stand against the first blow. So Moroi didn't. It came from the right this time. Krillel was equally skilled with both sides, and favored neither. Moroi did not stand against it, but neither did he flee from it. Krillel always followed the first strike with a second, so Moroi redirected it, stepping into Krillel's swing. He gripped the drill sergeant's wrist and moved it slightly to the side and upwards, so it would pass over his shoulder. In the same motion, Moroi twisted and rammed his own shoulder into the sergeant's chest with enough force to send him sprawling into the dirt. Moroik's smaller height allowed him to ram his shoulder into the center of the drill sergeant's chest, eliciting an oof from the taller swarm. A collective gasp sounded out from the gathered masses. It was rare for someone to give Krillel a hard enough blow to phase him, let alone knock him down. Moroi stood back a fair ways, allowing Krillel the chance to get to his feet. He could have moved in and attacked him on the ground, but Moroi wanted to prove himself, and he wanted to hurt Krillel. His pride was the one way to do it. For his part, Krillel snared and scrambled back to his feet, his lips twisting into a deep anger as he moved towards Moroi. Much more cautiously this time, though. The sergeant was angry, not stupid. He had seen his normal tactic had not worked, and so he changed up his strategy. He closed in with Moroi, and they began to circle each other, making probing jabs at each other. Moroi felt his foot slip in the particularly wet mud, and Krillel took fast advantage of it. He lunged forward, foot lifted in a vicious kick. Moroi saw it coming, but he could do nothing to stop it. With his own footing compromised, the best he could do was lift his forearm and take most of the blow, but his poor leverage meant that he didn't block much. The blow impacted against his chest, and he was thrown backwards, sliding in the mud. Krillel wasted no time in exploiting Moroik's relative helplessness. The viciously kicked at Moroi as he lay on the ground, with a poor defensive ability. Moroi did not seek to defend himself. Krillel had used this against Moroi many times before, and Moroi had prepared for it. His fist lashed out, reflexively enhanced by the training with the bandits, and collided with Krillel's rapidly approaching ankle. A faint yelp of pain told Moroi that he had been successful in his attempt, but what he had not accounted for was the unusual hardness of Crelal's skin and bones. Hitting it with his hand hurt. Stifling his own yelp of pain, Moroi used the momentary distracted state of his opponent to clamber back to his feet. They resumed circling each other, Moroi flexing his hand to alleviate some of the pain. He could see the sergeant was limping just slightly and gave a satisfied grin. Crelal saw it and gave Moroi a burning glare of anger. That gave Moroi the great confidence. If Crelal was feeling truly angry, he wasn't thinking straight, and he would become more careless. But it was a double-edged sword. His anger would mean that he was more dangerous if he caught Moroi, and anger bestowed strikes of greater power. Circling each other, searching for openings, Moroi saw one in Crelal's slight limp. It was a small one, and might have been negligible, but he took a chance and attacked. First feinting right and then striking left. Crelal did not fall for it. He easily blocked Moroik's attack and countered with his own, one Moroik was hard-pressed to avoid. But he did. Barely. But the mud again proved to be his undoing, used to fighting on the dry, shifting ground of the wastes. The slippery mud was treacherous for Moroik. But as he fell again, he grabbed the sergeant's forearm and dragged the bigger swim down as well. Crelal bowled against it, but the mud worked against him as well. He fell, landing in a tangle of limbs with Moroik, and down on the ground size did not matter nearly as much. As Crelal came tumbling down, Moroik lifted his knee and drove it under the sergeant's sternum, knocking the wind out of him. Crelal fought for air, and against Moroik, but the need for air was more pressing matter, and Moroik was free to rain blows down on the sergeant's feeble defences. He landed a number of good blows before the sergeant recovered his breath and roared with anger. With a frightful strength, Crelal shoved Moroik off of him, gaining the space enough to climb to his knees. Moroik scrambled to his knees as well and tried to go further, but Crelal crashed into him before he could. Down they went into another tangle, but Crelal possessing the upper hand, Moroik struggled against the sergeant, blocking his blow. But the sergeant was bigger and stronger, and it soon had the Moroik's arms trapped together under his arm and leg. With a free hand, Crelal struck Moroik across the face again and again. Striking the swarm in the face was difficult due to the sharp tusks, but Moroik only had one, leaving the left side of his face unprotected. He felt the side of his face growing numb, and he struggled harder against the sergeant's vice grips. It was no use. Moroik's vision had went and become red as blood filled his eye on the side, and he tasted blood in his mouth. Felt it run down his throat. A wild anger filled him, the anger of an animal caught in a trap. He would not be defeated by the swarm. Lying in the mud, beaten senseless. With a roar, Moroik bucked his hips. He twisted wildly, shaking Crelal loose. Before he was fully dislodged, the sergeant threw one more punch. As Moroik twisted and writhed under Crelal's weight, his body and head turned to the left and exposed the right side of his face to Crelal's punch, the side with the tusk. Crelal's desperate final punch was directly on the tip. The momentum carried it down into the full length. Moroik saw the tusk enter the middle of the sergeant's fist and continue through into the rest, ripping through the skin, sinew, and flesh, effectively splitting the sergeant's hand in half. Moroik felt blood flash against his face, gushing from Crelal's ruined hand. He smelled the iron tang of blood and heard the shrill scream, piercing and overwhelming. Twisting his face further, he ripped his tusk out of Crelal's hand, pulling flesh with it. The sergeant fell off, screaming and writhing in the mud. Moroik climbed to his feet, dizzy from the punishment inflicted on his face. He stood over Crelal and spat blood. "Looks like I win this one, Sergeant." Backing away, Moroik half fell, half sat in the mud, trying to catch his breath. A strand of red hung from his tusk, and he reached absent-mindedly to pull it off. When his fingers made contact, he realized it was muscle from Crelal's hand. strangling noise of disgust escaped his battled mouth as he flung the strip of kalal as far as he could with the body as possible. He suddenly became aware of the silence in the ring. It wasn't due to the damage inflicted on his ears, because he could hear Kralal's labored breath just fine. No. The gathered body of recruits, and now, lately looked, trained soldiers were dead silent. No one so much as cheered, booed, or made any other sound loud enough other than breath. Moroi glanced around with his good eye, trying to see why. A single swarm began clapping behind Moroi, and he twisted to see the seated position in the mud, straining to see who was clapping at his victory. The identity of who was nearly caused him to lose his precious grip on consciousness. Before him, dressed in a full uniform of a swarm army captain, was a face that Moroi had not seen for 5 years. Moroi, his brother. His brother who had left Moroi and his grandfather in poverty and need of help to join the army. Moroi had left and not looked back. 5 years ago, from what little news Moroi got of his brother, he knew Moroi had climbed through the ranks quickly due to his skill and ruthlessness. Moroi was the perfect swarm soldier, loyal, obedient, and utterly, totally devoted to the idea of the Empire and the Emperor. If he heard even a whisper of rebels, he would burn the planet to ash, with all the inhabitants, and not lose a moment of sleep over the death of thousands. Moroik's job just got a whole lot harder. Milak Wesk was never killed anyone, no. Milak is merely a tech specialist and a medic by choice. I nodded at the slight-bodied Haraith, listening intently to his story. Milak was a strange individual, but one who was indispensable to the bandits. One of the 200 new bandits who had arrived 3 weeks ago. Milak was one of 7 medics to arrive with them. I guess the higher-ups finally decided that we had enough fighters to warrant actual medics. I couldn't really blame them, though. Our casualty rate was significantly lower than any other unit that I knew of, and so we didn't need medics. Not often, anyway. Clint and I attributed it both to training and to the IPDM suits that Clint had created. We were the only unit fully implement them throughout, but that was only due to the fact that the rebellion couldn't make them fast enough. When the rebellion was fully outfitted, the swarm were in for a surprise. The suits let us march on them without fear of death. They could pour shot after shot into our suits, and we wouldn't even feel it. Of course, everything had its limits, and the suit could and did get overtaxed and burn up. But it provided a good 20 seconds of protection under heavy fire, and on the battlefield, the difference of a second could change the fight. Every new bandit had arrived, had their own suit, and we did not suffer shortages. Without the suits, we would have not been able to do the things that we did with the effectiveness that we did them. But the suits were just a tool. It was the wearers of the suits that got results. Each bandit was more than proficient in combat thanks to the instruction of Clint and myself. Able to function as a team and as individuals, the bandits were growing to be a formidable force. Milak does not care for bloodshed, but Milak sees why the rebellion must fight and wishes to help. The Haraith twisted a thin piece of wood between his fingers as he spoke, a keepsake or a talisman, most likely. His speech pattern was strange, only referring to himself in the third person, but I had met stranger individuals. None of the bandits, fortunately, but there was always the chance. But that was a partial reason I spoke to every new member of the bandits at least once before going on a mission with them. It wasn't that I had any particular interest in them or cared too deeply, but I wanted to know the men I fought beside, who were not insane and could be relied upon in a tough situation. It wasn't likely, as every bandit had to pass their mental evaluations before becoming a rebel, let alone a bandit, and there was always a chance. I didn't like taking chances, and I didn't have to take. I nodded at the slight rise and filed him away under the strange but not an issue file in my mind. Besides, there was a feeling about him that I couldn't quite place, but it made me trust him. Clint had a very similar feeling, and he was one of the most trustworthy beings that I had ever met, provided that he liked you. Clint tended to like most people fighting the Swarm Empire, unless you were scum. Then he may kill you. "Lieutenant, we're coming on up to the battle cruiser," the pilot called from his seat. I gave my acknowledgement and turned to face the rest of the bandits, seated in the belly of the troop transport. 30 of the heartless, deadliest fighters in the rebellion They had to be good to get into the bandits, and after Clint and I got our hands on them, they became truly formidable. Now we were going to take the Swarm battlecruiser. Clint had been dead serious when he said that he wanted to build a fleet. With 300 bandits, we attacked airfields, training camps, supply posts, with brutal and violent introductions to the life of a bandit. The newcomers who survived their trial by fire, as Clint called it, quickly became hard fighters and skilled soldiers. We laid waste to dozens of Swarm installations, suffering minimum casualties. The Swarm died by the hundreds. We gathered a fleet of support ships, troop carriers, and scout ships. The Ilarian base became a staging ground for an overgrowing army, one that was actually too large to fit in the base. We had struggled, along with ships, of having a good number of bandits out on patrol and missions, but the arrival of new fighters had finally pushed the issue. We needed more room, which was why we were attacking the Swarm battlecruiser by ourselves, without the support of any ship larger than a small troop transport. Ideally, the rebellion would have let us use several full-size cruisers and battleships, but they did not have the ships to spare. So Clint decided that it would be best for us to attack the fleet of smaller ships, slipping in under the sensors and shields before the Swarm noticed. Once in, Clint would fly Susan containing some of the bandits' best fighters into the hangar, where they would quickly overwhelm the unprepared Swarm guards, and the hangar would become a staging ground for the assault. The more technically inclined of the bandits would lock down the hangar controls and ensure the Swarm could not vent the atmosphere and blow us all out into space, which was exactly what we were trying to do with them. Each team was tasked with taking control of key parts of the ship, the bridge, the engine room, the comms room, the other essential locations. Once command had been assumed of the key sections, the doors were to be locked, the rooms isolated, and the atmosphere vented across the rest of the ship. That would hopefully kill all the remaining Swarm aboard. The only problem was that we had to first get there. Clint would be leading the vanguard, flying Susan in under the sensors. He and his squad would assume control of the hangar and usher the rest of us in. I would be there with him, but if anything happened to him, the bandits needed a leader, so I remained behind, floating amongst the stars, waiting for the moment to attack. It was not long in coming. A single word burst out through the comm, and it did not take long, because I could feel the ship accelerate under me. It was time. "Listen up," I called to my squad. "You all know why we are here and what we're doing. Stick to the plan and don't get cocky. Keep that in mind and we shouldn't have any trouble." They nodded their affirmations. I did the last-minute inventory of my gear. IPDM suit, check. Plasma rifle, check. Pistol, check. Various knives, check. Working comm, check. Helmet, check. Odds and ends, check. I could see several other bandits doing the same as me, methodically going over their gear, making sure that it was where it was supposed to be. Milak rustled through his medic bag and his lips moving silently. "Here comes the hangar. Looks cleared." At the sound of the pilot's voice, my squad tensed, preparing for the assault. I tensed too. There wasn't anything quite like feeling before a battle. My muscles were tensed, yet relaxed at the same time. My heart beat sped up, and I could feel every thump distinctly. I inhaled, and the air filled my lungs and to the brim, spreading out into my blood. I could not feel it, but I knew that my eyes dilated, and I curled my lips in a faint snarl. The ship thumped, and it touched down with several bandits stumbled in place. I stood firm. "Door up in 3, called the pilot. With a hiss of the mechanics, the door slid open, exposing us to the space outside of our ship. It was clear of all swarm, Clint's team having mopped them up when they landed. The wide hangar was now on with a handful of small bandit ships and a dozen guards, ensuring that our only means of escape, should be the things turned bad, was to be taken by the swarm. I glanced around the hangar, searching for the right corridor. I overlaid the mental map of the ship Clint had us all memorize. It was a good thing that the swarm stuck to the same design building of the ships. All this would have been a touch more difficult. I ran towards the correct door once I saw it, and my team followed. Our objective was to take the communications room. There was quite a bit of delicate equipment that would not do well in a vacuum. I did not expect heavy resistance for a good while. We were taking the same route as Mai and his squad, but they had landed before us, and I could see the plasma blasts on the walls and the dead swarm littering the corridor en route. was doing his job well. I led a quick and determined pace, but I did not sprint. There was no reason to tire my team out and myself before we even got to the comm room. At the pace that I'd set, I could run for the rest of the day. Even Mylak, the diminutive medic, could keep up with this pace. I glanced back to see him in the middle of the cluster, protected as much as possible. He was wearing an IPDM suit which would ward off the most harm, but it never hurt to protect your medic. Despite having cleaned out the space before us, I still kept my head on swivel and instructed my team to do the same. There was no good that could come from being careless. A swarm poked his head out from a door, and 3 plasma bolts reduced it to ash. Before I could even pull the trigger, the body slid slowly down the wall as we ran past. I could hear the sounds of plasma fire echoing around the ship as the bandits overwhelmed the unprepared swarm. It was too easy. No one had ever assaulted a battlecruiser without at least 3 other cruiser-sized ships, and so the swarm thought nothing of a swarm of small ships. Oh, how wrong they were. The sound of plasma fire grew sharper and more distinct as I travelled down the corridor. We must be catching up to Bohr's team. From the sounds of it, he was engaged with a sizable force of swarm. Glancing behind me, I saw my team had prepared themselves for a fight. We rounded the curve, and the battle came into view. Bohr and his team were crowded around a wide doorway, firing into a cavernous room that, as far as I could see, was empty of everything but swarm. At the other end of the room, a large number of swarm were barricaded behind raised metal sheets and a stack of what looked to be chairs. Looking closer, I could see the sheets of metal were tables laid on their sides. So this was the mess hall then. The swarm must have gotten word that we were coming and prepared defenses. They were doing an admirable job, I had to admit. Bohr's advance had been ground to a halt, and several of his men were down. They were all moving, so I did not worry overmuch. With a signal from my hand, I told Mylak to look at them. I motioned for my team to take up positions with Bohr's team, making my way to Bohr himself. They started to exchange fire with the swarm as I reached the horizon, with unusually bright red tentacles. "These pigs giving you trouble?" I asked Bohr. He glanced at me before returning to his study of the enemy position. I didn't know exactly what a pig was, but Clint told me that it was an animal from Earth, whom the swarm shared a remarkable resemblance to. He meant it as an insult, though, so I used it too. "Not too much," Bohr replied. "They're just stubborn, as far as I know. There is no easy way around them. I was attempting the tried and true method of blasting through them." I nodded sagely. "That does seem to work." At that moment, one of the bandits crowding the door yelped and clutched the side of his head. Within seconds, the bandits had been pulled back from his place and pulled. Mylak rushed over to him and fussed about for a moment. Bohr nodded towards the medic. "You brought him into combat." "He's a combat medic, Bohr. It's his job." Yeah, but Boar shrugged. He doesn't seem the type to be within 100 miles of war. I glanced over at the medic who had bandaged the wounded bandit's head. He was only missing a part of his ear, much like myself, nothing serious, and he moved on to the next. He moved with the determination and purpose I like to see, and he was quite knowledgeable about injuries. He would be fine. I think he'd surprise you, Boar. I focused back on the swarm barricade and saw the ranks had thinned a bit. This is taking too long. Don't the swarm know that we're on a schedule? Boar chuckled. I'd say that they're trying to delay that as long as possible. I nodded glumly. Wish Jewer was still around. He'd have snuck right up to them and cleaned them all out before they even knew the shadow next to them was loaded. Boar frowned for a moment. The loss of Jewer and Vienna and the other 3 bandits had not been easy for us. We'd spent weeks scouring the system where they had been lost, but found no trace of them. I harumphed, putting my mind out of a dark place, as it had a tendency to find itself. Time to get this over with. I hefted my rifle up and took up a position in the center of the doorway. Let him have it, I shouted, to encourage the bandits to fire at once. It worked. A near-solid wave of plasma washed over the swarm and burned through a good number of them. While they mulled about in temporary confusion, I leapt out of the doorframe and into the wide open, yelling a wordless battle cry. I charged the swarm line, firing wildly, not inaccurately, just wildly. I felt plasma shot impact my chest. I felt the heat spread across my body. Not long ago, that would have been the end of me, and I would have been just another corpse. A neat, smoking hole burned through me, but instead I stood firm and returned fire. The swarm who'd shot me had a look of utter surprise plastered across his face when I cut him down. The many swarm did not fare much better, as they were cut down by the bandits charging behind me. Only a few survivors remained, crouching against the barricade for shelter. They returned fire doggedly. They were quite determined, it seemed, but they would quickly fall. A roar echoed through the corridor behind them, when it came an even repetitive thud, thud, thud. Everyone stopped where they were, guns ceasing, breathing slowed. What was the cause of the horrendous noise? What creature could create? 3 massive Urg came into view, barreling down the corridor. Giant hulking brutes Urg were the shock troopers of the swarm, the only race trusted by the Empire armies other than the swarm themselves. Small Urg stood somewhere around 6.5 feet. The truly monstrous ones stood at 10. These 3 were somewhere around 8 feet. Their dark grey skin was thick and resistant to most trauma. Carved razor claws and sharpened teeth gave the Urg a sufficient advantage in unarmed combat, which was unfortunate, as this skin served as a natural IPDM suit. The Urg smashed through the barricade and the swarm had built, sending the thick tables and chairs flying through the air. I ducked under the table and felt it brush my fur as it passed overhead. The trio crashed into the center of the room and bellowed a challenge at us. "Shoot them!" Boar shouted, his voice rock-steady, without a hint of fear. Startled bandits opened up fire on the Urg and had little effect. The most of the Urg did was turn their faces away from the blinding light. Roaring again, they leapt up onto the bandits surrounding them and swept their long-clawed arms around. Several bandits went flying, blood splattering into the air. "Back away!" I shouted. "Hit them from a distance." I didn't really have to tell the bandits that, as they had already spread out at the moment the Urg attacked. Plasma hit the Urg from all sides, and they spun, clawing futilely around, trying to stop the burning of the plasma. It would not permanently damage them, but it did sting a good bit. The only way to kill an Urg was in hand-to-hand combat, ramming a knife into the hearts or brains. The swarm had bred the Urg to be tough bastards, and it worked all too well. I squared my shoulders and loosened my knives from their sheaths. I held my gun out to Boar. He took it with an expression of bewilderment on his face. "You're not actually going to fight those things, are you?" I chuckled. Can't be too hard, Clint's done it all the time. You keep them distracted, though, or I'll haunt you for the rest of your days." With that, I slipped my knives out of them and ran towards the Erg. The nearest one had his back turned towards me, still spinning in an attempt to get away from the blinding light. I leapt, burying my knife into his back to provide leverage that I could reach up to his head. I stabbed my other knife into the back of his skull. It took a good deal more effort than I had anticipated, and it merely struck into the bone rather than piercing its brain. The Erg roared and flailed his arms, scrabbling to get me off. I yanked my knife out and scrabbed again, this time in the correct force. The blade slid into the skull, and I could feel the body relax under me. He started to topple. I pulled my knives free and rolled away. Now the two surviving Erg were aware of my presence and had lowered themselves into combat stance, claws at the ready. The one on the left was closer and was presenting a much bigger target. I threw my knife left-handed, much more forcefully than I usually did, and it sailed between the Erg's outstretched arms. Erg were not the most coordinated beings in the galaxy, and sank into the Erg's left eye. It squealed in pain and fell back, clutching its eye. I dismissed him as disabled and focused on the last Erg. He was the smallest of them, but he seemed to be the most brutal. Crimson and green blood dripped from his claws, blood from the fallen bandits. I narrowed my eyes at him and flipped another knife in my hand. I spun them idly, waiting for an opening. Plasma fire, which had slowed during my attack, resumed, flashing across my opponent's face. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision. I charged him, knives held at the ready. Pushing off of my leaning foot, I sailed into the air, aiming for his chest. But I never arrived. I jerked mid-air, and my momentum redirected straight into the ground. I collided with a solid metal floor and impacted with a forced all of the air from my chest. A loud pop came through my body, followed by a great deal of pain. My left shoulder had been shattered. I glanced back to see what had slammed me into the ground. The half-blinded Erg grinned, his big hand wrapped around my ankle. I twisted, struggling against his crushing grip. Pain in my shoulder threatened to overwhelm me. I pushed it away. It was to no avail. The Erg was too strong. I could hear the plasma shots being fired and see them impacting on the Erg's skin, but that did nothing to help. Instead, I heaved my body off the ground and nearly blacked out from the pain in my shoulder. While lunging forward, I just slammed my knife into the Erg's hand. He let go of my leg with a yelp of pain, and that was the second time my knives had tasted his blood. I was halfway to my feet before I was hit again from behind by the felt like an entire ship. I flew forward, crashing onto my hands and knees. Several ribs had popped with that strike. I pushed myself up on my knees, turning to face the Erg. The sounds of plasma fire and yelling bandits faded from my ears, and my body diverted attention from the less important senses to the ones trying to keep me alive. My reactions were sluggish, despite all the effort my body was going through. My vision darkened as a half-blind Erg blocked the ceiling lights. Before I could react, he swept his clawed hand across my face, slicing open the skin. My vision went dark from the blood running into my eyes, my body flying backwards from the force of the hit. I couldn't see or hear where the Erg was, but I could feel him walk across the metal floor, the impacts of its stride rattling my bones, sending my shattered shoulder into new spasms of agony. I could not see him, but I knew that he'd stopped next to me. The next thing I felt was his foot crush my chest. My ribs splintered, the shards tearing through my muscles and skin. My lungs flattened under the force of the blow. All air squeezed from them like a fruit squeezed at the juice in a press. My heart popped. The pain from my shoulder and sliced face faded away before the pain on my ruined chest. No, all the pain was gone. It was all... My watched in horror as the Erg grabbed Tedix's legs and slammed him into the ground. He could hear the bones break from here. Bormai yelled in rage. He opened fire on the Erg, who had struck Tedix in the back, sending the Jahan flying. Bormai sprinted forward, a knife in one hand, seeking to distract the Urg from his fallen prey. Bormai watched with numb dread as the Urg stomped on Tedex's chest. There was no way Tedex had survived that. The chest had been destroyed by the Urg stomp, and there was nothing left but a pile of shattered ribs and ruptured organs. As the two Urg turned to face Bor, there was only one thought in his mind. Tedex Jakku was dead. End of chapter. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you did, please consider subscribing. If you wish to support the author, there is a link to the original story, so pop over there and give him your support. If you wish to support this channel, however, there are a few ways to do so. The best and easiest would be to share this video with other people, as well as liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. All of these things tell the algorithm that this channel is at least vaguely interesting, and that may share it with other people. If you wish to support the channel in some other manner, watching my other videos would also help tremendously. Or, if you really like, there is a link down below to leave a tip or to join the Patreon. Any and all support is very much appreciated. And I hope that you all have a good one until the next time, and I'll see you then. Cheers.